Good morning and good evening to Professor Yu. I'm really honored to be with us today of Geshin. We're really looking forward for this event. I would like to thank you, Professor Zanotti, to be with us too today to introduce Professor Yu, and Professor Mazza, who unfortunately can't be with us today, but helped us to organize this event. And my colleague from Geshin that supported me during the organization of this event. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So, Professor Zanotti, would you like to introduce Professor for us? Thank you.
Thank you, Rosaria. Thank you, all members and students of the Geshin Association for organizing this. I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm going to say just a few words to introduce our very distinguished guest, and then I leave the floor to Professor Yu. Professor Yu is, Angela Yu is a professor of modern Japanese and comparative literature at Sophia University in Tokyo. Her areas of research include modernism, urban literature, cross-border literature, Sino-Japanese literary studies, war and post-war literature, utopian studies, and contemporary literature. She is the editor of Three-Dimensional Reading, Stories of Time and Space in Japanese Modernist Fiction, published in 2013. Other recent publications include the literature in Japanese, Nihongo Bungaku, an examination of the new literature topography by plurilingual writers from the 1990s in Japanese language and literature, and another article, The Strange Birds and Beasts in Oyamada Hiroko's The Factory, Kōjō, published in 2010. This article was published in the book Differences in the City, Post-Metropolitan Heterotopias as Liberal Utopian Dreams, which was recently published last year in 2020. Now, today, Professor Yu is going to deliver a talk on the subject Heterotopia in Oyamada Hiroko's story of amazing birds and beasts. And it's a great pleasure to be here to introduce her, and we have a very large attendance, so I'm expecting a very lively Q&A session after this talk. So please join me in welcoming our guest today, Professor Angela Yu. Welcome to Venice, and you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zanotti. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And it is really a great pleasure for me to meet you and your students. And I'm really excited about traveling to Venice this evening. I've never done that before. I've been to Venice twice physically. I think the last time was about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's such a beautiful place. I would always want to go to Venice. And tonight, so in this, pandemic, and, we're all going through lockdowns of different kinds. Tokyo is still going through the state of emergency, so we still cannot travel anywhere. So it's really a wonderful treat for me to be able to, travel to Venice online and meet you all, and have a chance to talk to you and your students. I particularly, first of all, want to thank Rosaria for inviting me or extending the invitation to me, and for preparing this event. I know that she has been working, very hard to set this up, and she exchanged many emails with me, and she also produced that beautiful poster that I would want to keep always. So thank you very much, Rosaria, and this is a wonderful job. And thank you all of you for coming. I see 113 people under participants, and I'm really impressed and touched that so many people would take the time to come listen to this little talk that I would like to present. So now, may I share a screen with you so that you will be looking at my PowerPoint? Okay, so I think you can see my screen with the title Heterotopia and Oyamada Hiroko's Story of Amazing Birds and Beasts. And some of you might have come across the chapter in the book that was recently published, but it was really published just a few months ago. So maybe you would not have read it yet. And I hope actually you would not have, because I'm going to talk about things that I wrote about in that chapter. And if you have already read it, you might find it a little bit repetitive because, you know, it's more or less the same content. But I would also like to add a few really spontaneous thoughts as I, you know, talk to you all. And I will try not to read from a script because that will, you know, make you go to sleep. And I would just talk based on the slides. And I would really look forward to getting your questions and comments at the end of the talk. I was asked to talk for an hour, but I think if I talk for a whole hour, you might be very tired of my voice. And I would like to actually talk within maybe 40 minutes or so, and to leave a lot of time for everyone to ask questions and to really chat, I think, informally. First of all, Oyamada Hiroko is not an author that perhaps many of you are very familiar with because she has not been translated. And I think she really deserves a lot of attention and translation, but she is one of those writers who are still really waiting to be discovered, like a gem that is hidden. And I want to talk about this story because I find it very fascinating and very appropriate to what we're seeing of contemporary Japan now. Now, some of you might have been to Japan, probably not, you know, last year or this year, but maybe even in recent years. And I think your image of Japan, whether you've been to Japan, especially Tokyo, or your image of Japan online, pictures that you see, is that it is always very prosperous. People are very neat, and, you know, a lot of like fairly well-off people, and no one has any need. But it actually in Japan there is a lot of poverty, and there are homeless people, and 1 in 6 children live under the poverty line because they would not even have enough food at home. But these are things that we never see. And in encountering this story, I find that Oyamada Hiroko is creating a heterotopia, meaning another space to force us to look at, you know, the space of poverty, the space of deprivation, the space and the people who populate these spaces that we never get to see in our daily lives, or even if we see them, we choose not to see. So I would like to then go to the first slide about the contents of this talk. First of all, this is the main argument of my talk. I'm going to draw your attention to this immense industrial zone in the factory, which is Kōjō, the name of this, the title of the story, and to argue that this industrial zone is a mirror of the invisible world of the underclass in contemporary Japan. And the strange birds and beasts in the story are reflections of the largely silent, non-regular workers, such as freighters, contract workers, and temp workers, people like that who are subsisting at the underbelly of society. And as I go on, I would say a little bit more about what freighters are. Some of you may know, but some of you may not be familiar with terms that are really, you know, it sounds like English, but it's a created Japanese term. And I would like to start with just an overall context about women writers and dystopia and heterotopia in contemporary Japanese literature. So this will be a very brief introduction in the context. And then I will take you through a couple of key concepts of heterotopia, drawing mainly from Michel Foucault. And then a few words about the author Oyamada Hiroko and a synopsis of the story. And then I would like to explore some of these questions together with you. These include the contemporary Japanese underclass, the factory as heterotopia, the amazing birds and beasts that we encounter in the story, And then the idea of crossing over to the other side, meaning from this world to the other space or the other world. And then from these questions, I would like to draw a conclusion. And then actually with most stories, especially with Japanese literature, the story itself doesn't have a conclusion, and it's hard in literary studies to say there is one conclusion to the story. But I would still like to draw some observations about the story, some reflections in order to share with you. So now I would start with the context, which is the women writers and dystopian heterotopia. So on top of the slide, you would notice that there are three books that I've chosen to introduce to you. Some of you, I think, have read these books because all of them are translated and they're prize-winning translations also. The one on the left is Ogawa Yoko, and it's called The Memory Police. And the one in the middle is Tawada Yoko, whom some of you are familiar with, and it's called The Emissary. And then the one on the right is by umili. It's called Tokyo Ueno Station, and which recently won the National Book Award, a very, very prestigious award. And the one in the middle, The Emissary, also won the National Book Award for translation a couple of years ago. And The Memory Police was also, shortlisted for the award. So what we are seeing in these stories, these are three contemporary women writers, and they explore different types of dystopian heterotopia in their stories. I would suggest that what we're seeing in these stories is that they're exploring the space and place of women in Japanese society. And they grapple with issues of freedom of speech, public health and safety in the nuclear age. They also look at poverty, gender inequality, neurodiversity, and physical diversity, as well as age, especially old age. And I would like to explain some of these terms in greater details with reference to these works as context. The term neurodiversity refers to really many neurological conditions, such as autism, such as ADHD, such as all sorts of different ways in which our brains process the world, which makes some people a little bit different from others. In the past, we have terms such as, this person is autistic, or that person is hyperactive, or this person is schizophrenic and all that. And to see all these conditions as mainly just pathological or needy. But what we're seeing in the other spaces of this literature is that many of these writers are actually exploring these other spaces or these other neurological conditions as really a different way of perceiving the world, a new kind of perception that, for instance, people with autism will be capable of seeing a world that regular people cannot see, in terms of sounds, in terms of colors, in terms of sensitivity. So we're seeing these other worlds, these other spaces being explored and being really truly reflected and appreciated in some of these works. And again, freedom of speech, we might feel that Japan is a free country and everyone can say everything you want. But as it turned out, actually, there is a great deal of self-censorship and reservation in the way people talk or communicate. And there is a great deal of sensitivity towards hierarchy, so that a younger person, such as many of you, graduate students, you may want to say something if you're in Japan, but you feel that, oh, I cannot say that in front of this professor because, he or she is so much older, and I don't want to, say something that is that opposes or contradicts or challenges what he or she thinks. So you end up actually, not having a full range of freedom of speech. And in particular, women would be more deferential to people above them or men. either men in their immediate environment, in the family, in the workplace, or men in general. So there's a great deal of, this kind of reservation, self-censorship that you see in Japanese society, that these women, from their perspective, are exploring. And this is what Ogawa Yoko, for instance, is exploring in The Memory Police, that words that are not allowed to be used or not, not fashionable anymore, or words that might lead you into trouble, they are slowly eliminated from society. And once they're eliminated from people's memory, those words disappear and those concepts disappear. Tawada Yoko, the one in the middle, in The Emissary, she is exploring after the 3/11, meaning the nuclear explosion 10 years ago, that it came after the great earthquake and the tsunami. We had nuclear explosion in the nuclear plants. She explores what a post-nuclear world is like in Japan, and how the myth of safety is actually a myth in itself, that it is not true, and that she explores the possibility of children being very frail and old people being able to live into over 100 years old, in a world that we have not imagined before, of a great metamorphosis and transformation. And umili in Tokyo Ueno Station is exploring a place that, anyone who has been to Tokyo would have gone through Tokyo Ueno Station. That's where you have the zoo and the panda and also some museums and stuff. It seems like a world that is very much part of our everyday world, definitely. Many people go through that station. But she looks at that world through the eyes of an old man, and also the eyes of homeless people just setting up, their blue tarp tents in and out of the station, around the station, in the park. And she explored a world that most of us, when we go visit, when we go through Ueno Station, or when we go visit the zoo, the park, the museums, most of us would see these people, but we actually will not see them. That it is the world of the unseen that she is exploring in her world. So these are just a few examples of these women writers who want to explore dystopia and heterotopia in these works, to really force us to see a world that most people choose not to see. And as you know, women, gender, what we call disparity in Japan is still a very, very big problem. There are still very few women Congress, in the Congress or in the Diet, very few women politicians. Women still occupy a much lower rung in society. The income disparity is very great. So these women writers are also forcing us to see the world from the perspective of a woman, and to really explore why so many things are going wrong still with a contemporary Japan that on the surface may look very glittery, very bright, and very cheerful, and even very rich. And they are using the other space, meaning the heterotopia, as a space to satirize and reflect on reality. And finally, these women writers, they tend not to present you with a utopia, but they present you dystopias and heterotopias as, first of all, most obviously warnings. If you do that, in the nuclear age, this is the kind of horrible, world that you may envision. But at the same time, I would also argue that because they're presenting another world that is more frightening, more threatening, and also another world to compare to our present reality, they are actually introducing a margin of hope in these stories for us to, if we turn our attention to these worlds that we refuse to see in their works through the fiction, that we will become more sensitized to the wrongs or what we need to fix in society. And thus, through these works, we learn to want to, build a better world, both for the present world as well as the world for the future. So I would argue that in the end, heterotopia and dystopias are also stories that embody really a great deal of possibility for a more hopeful future. Now, let me then take you to some key concepts of heterotopia, mainly drawing from Michel Foucault's Of Other Spaces. This is actually a very short essay that you can easily access online. It's uploaded on many different sources, both in English. I'm sure there's an Italian translation. I will just choose a couple of concepts that will apply to my reading of Oyamada Hiroko's work to share with you. First of all, we want to look at the transformation of a reality into an unreal or a virtual space. What Foucault calls a mirror, a Foucauldian mirror, that's what we will call it. Foucault distinguishes the world in a mirror from the placeless utopia, in that the mirror does exist in reality and thus exerts a kind of counteraction on the position that one occupies. When we get into the story, you would notice that in the story, there's a river and there's the sea. The river empties into the sea. And that, the surface of water always acts as a kind of natural mirror. And the story is about, this other world that is reflected in the mirror of the water. And what is that world? And what does that world force us to see? Another concept is to juxtapose a real place with several other spaces. And Foucault suggested the stage and the garden. So basically, it's actually a very straightforward idea. Foucault is suggesting that when we put up a play, like a drama, on a stage, you're sitting in a room, but there's a stage. And then as you look at the stage, you're transported into a different reality. If it's a Shakespearean play, you will be transported into the medieval times. If it's a contemporary play, say set in Japan, you might be sitting in Venice, but you're transported into a world in Japan. And interestingly, these days that we spend so much time online on Zoom, that you're sitting in Venice and you're transported actually to, my space here in Japan, and even to my room where I do my work and where I, live and all that. So the stage or the other place as a counter place in the place that you occupy. And by extension, the garden or the zoo is also that kind of space. So if you visit a zoo, all of a sudden you're transported to the tropics, you're transported to the Arctic if you see a polar bear. So it's like a microcosm within a larger reality. It is part of that larger reality, but it is also cut off and different from that reality. And to that, we can add the example of the prison. The prison is always a place that is enclosed, but also part of a reality that we occupy, but it is a different kind of reality. And then to this, Oyamada throws in the factory as a possible counter space. So we will be looking at that in this story. And another point about heterotopia is actually about the sense of time. And we call that heterochronies, which is slices in time. So the easiest thing to think about slices in time in our actual reality is that if you go to a museum, in Italy, you have, of course, all the wonderful museums in the world. Immediately you go to the Uffizi Museum or any of the beautiful museums that you have in Venice, you will be transported into a different time immediately. And in Japan, if you go to Ueno Park, you can go to the modern museum, you can go to the classical traditional museum, you'll be transported into the different slices in time. And all these slices in time coexist in this very same moment. They are different, but they coexist at the same time. And Foucault is drawing our attention to these things. And Finally, another point is that Heterotopias has a system of opening and closing that isolate them and make them accessible. So we will look at it in the factory as we get into the story, and we would see how the factory allows people to enter, but it also kind of confines them within that place and isolate them within that place. And then people may want to try to seek escape from that place also. But there is always, you can enter, you can exit. There's opening and there's closing. And then next, heterotopia is a space of illusion that exposes every real space. For instance, we think of a colony, or it is also a space that is another real space, as perfect, meticulous, as well arranged as ours is messy, ill-constructed, and jumbled. So as a real example from this story, I would like to introduce the factory as a space of illusion, because you will find out as we go on that the factory in this story is very fantastical, but it is also meant to, reveal the real space of what we inhabit. And we say we, I'm drawing on contemporary Japanese society. So to apply that, to say that the fantastical factory in the story actually exposes the messiness and the really the darkness, or the in many ways really the horror of a world in contemporary Japan that we refuse to see. Next, I would like to introduce the author very quickly. You would notice that she is still really quite young. She was born in 1983. I mean, young in terms of, to me, she's very young compared to you who are very, very young. She may not appear as young, but she is, still a very, young author. She was awarded the prestigious Akutagawa Prize in 2014. And her 3 anthologies to date is called The Factory. And in this anthology, The Factory, the story itself is one of the major stories, which is one of the longest story in the anthology. But there are also other stories in this collection. Another collection is called The Whole, in Japanese is Alla, that was published in 2014. And another story is called, another anthology is called The Garden, Niwa. So from the title of these anthologies, you would notice that she is pretty obsessed with real, unreal, and symbolic spaces. And today we will focus on The Factory. First, I would like to give you a synopsis of the story. You would notice that on this slide, there are pictures of 3, creatures. I will get to that in a moment. Oyamada Hiroko in this story creates a heterotopia filled with strange birds and beasts to reflect and problematize the real-life issues of an underclass of underpaid menial workers trapped in estranged labor in contemporary Japanese society. The spatial dimension of Heterotopia is an immense industrial zone that resembles an oversized town, but space alone is not the determining factor in the formulation of a heterotopic site. It is the non-human living creatures, numerous haunting blackbirds called factory cormorants, overgrown rodents called nutorias, and creepy washing machine lizards that make her imaginary landscape eerie and bizarre, but at the same time serve as a mirror and a connection to a real place inhabited by humans rendered less than human by virtue of the mode of employment and the alienating nature of their jobs. Narrated through the perspectives of 3 employees, the factory reveals a heterotopia that is as strange as it is familiar in comparison to an expanding stratum in contemporary Japanese society, where humans work, live, and perish like the mysterious birds and beasts in the story. So now you know why there are the pictures of these birds and beasts. And I will say a little bit more about them as we go on. Next, before I get to the story, I would like to introduce the social context for which we can situate the story. And for that, I would like to introduce this work by this sociologist by the name of Hashimoto Kenji. And the title of his work in Japanese is called Shin Nihon no Kaikyō Shakai. This can be translated into the New Japanese Class Society. And first of all, many of you might think that, oh, Japan is not supposed to be a class society. I mean, since Meiji abolished the 4 classes of, samurai, farmers, merchants and all that, Japan is not supposed to be a class society. But what Hashimoto Kenji is arguing is that there is actually these what we call invisible but truly existing class differentiation in contemporary Japan. And he is drawing our attention particularly to the contemporary Japanese underclass. As many of you know, in the 1970s and 80s, Japan went through a period of rapid economic growth, leading to the slogan of 100 million middle class, Ichioku Sochuryu. And this, of course, the Ichioku is a rounded figure to stand for the entire population of Japan. So the slogan really means, and the entire Japan is middle class. So everyone is more or less, well off. And actually, in the 1980s, Japan was going through the economic bubble, as was, many other parts of the world, especially the United States. And because of the economic bubble, there was a great deal of need for cheap labor. And that gave rise to the proliferation of the underclass, meaning a lot of people hired at a low wage for mass production. This gives rise to many non-regular workers, which in Japan, overall, these are called hiseki. That's the term for non-regular workers. Instead of regular workers, and the term for regular workers is seishain, meaning, seishain are hired as full-time employees with a lot of benefits and, stability in employment to some extent. But non-regular workers are really, they're just hired either for the job or for the day or for a period of time, and they have very little training and benefits. And before the rise of this whole really class or troop of non-regular workers, there were already what we call arubaito. I think many of you have heard of this term in Japanese. It comes from of course, the French word arbeit. And usually it refers to, in the past, students who are just, especially high school or college students, you have some free time, so you work in a convenience store or you work on delivery or something. And also in the past, you also have many housewives and post-retirement workers working as part-time workers, which is called pato in Japan. However, from the 1980s on, we're witnessing a new troop of college grads, meaning these are people with a college degree. They joined the workforces as fritas, meaning this refers to non-regular and temp workers. They have no job training. They hold usually dead-end jobs, and they have very little hiring benefits in terms of, healthcare or in terms of retirement funds and all that. So they work under very poor conditions. And the term fritters, some of you may know this term. For those who may be new to the term fritters, it's of course a made-up word in Japanese. Even though it looks like it's English, it's definitely not an English word. It's a combination of freelance, so the Japanese take the part that says free, and then the other part is the arubaito, but they take the term to indicate arubaita, meaning people who work part-time, So they put these two words together, one in English and one in German, and create this Japanese frita, which refers to people who really work on these non-regular jobs with very little benefit and job training. And in the 1990s, we experienced the burst of the bubble in Japan and also in many parts of the world. And then that leads to a prolonged economic recession that lasted over 20 years. And we were actually seeing perhaps Japan coming out perhaps of the recession in the past few years, that people are getting jobs and the economy was getting slightly better. But then all of a sudden we're hit by the pandemic. So we're entering, of course, obviously the beginning of a long-term recession again. So so this is what we're seeing in Japanese society and economy. And these conditions lead to the rise of an entire underclass. And again, I draw your attention to another book by Hashimoto Genji called Underclass. In Japanese, the term is andakurasu. It's not a brand new term, but this term has not been used. It has been kind of like, in some ways, a taboo. And in some ways, people refuse to acknowledge that there's an underclass in Japan. So people refuse to acknowledge that there's a whole term existing for people who work in the underbelly of society. And what is the reality of the underclass in Japan? By 2012, and the reason I'm going back a little bit in time is that the story was published in 2011. So I'm backtracking a little bit to around the time the story was published. By 2012, there are 9.3 million freeters, meaning non-regular workers, and they make up 14.9% of the working population, which is very, very large percentage. These are contract workers, which we call keiyaku shain, or temp workers, haken shain. The average income is 1.86 million yen, and the poverty rate is 38.7%. So maybe to you, it might be a little bit you may not know what it means to just be earning 1.8 million yen. I don't know how much that is in Italian lira. In US dollars, in those days, in around 2012, it will be about $23,000. And in Japan, if you make 1.86 million yen at that time or now, it will be very hard for you to, afford a decent living, or, you can live from hand to mouth, but you will not have any saving. And if you try to raise a family, it will be really impossible. And the percentage of unmarried people among those aged 20 to 59 among this population of, the non-regular workers, this 9.3 million freeders, these people living within this poverty rate, the percentage of unmarried people was 66.4% for men and 56.1% for women. So that means a lot of people remain unmarried for reasons that financially they can afford it, they cannot afford it, and for various reasons of, they just cannot find the right suitable people. They just, cannot afford to have a family. Now, I would like to take you to the underclass in the factory. Now we're zooming in a little bit into the story, and we will be encountering the three characters. First of all, we have a character called Ushiyama Yoshiko. So I think we will call her Yoshiko. She is 26 years old. She has a college degree, but she's applying for the 6th job in 4 years. She goes from one job to another, never worked longer than a year, obviously. And in the factory, she was hired as a non-regular worker, even though she applied to be a seishain, but she was only given a non-regular job. to shred unwanted documents. So that's her job, day in, day out, she, shreds documents. Her brother, who doesn't have a name in the story and only known as ore, a rough term for I in Japanese for a man. He used to be a system engineer, but he was laid off because of company restructuring, which in Japanese is called ristora. And he was hired as a temp worker to edit mind-numbing prose, such as manuals and recalls. So it was very, very boring work for him and not challenging at all. And then finally, we have Furufue Yoshio. You would notice immediately that the name Yoshiko and Yoshio, they share the same sound and the same meaning, most likely. So they're in some ways male and female version of each other. Yoshio is a doctoral student studying the taxonomy of mosses, meaning how to categorize different mosses. It is in itself, of course, an interesting subject, but very, very specialized. So it made it very, very difficult for him to actually apply his skills to a job and to look for a job that needs his kind of very specialized skills. And he falls under the category of what we call highly educated working poor, kogakureki working poor, or degree refugees, gakureki nanmin. What happens is that in the 1990s, the Japanese government decided to create more PhDs in Japan. However, at the same time, companies and universities were not creating more jobs for people with the PhDs. So as a result, you have many people who spend, many years getting a PhD, and when they come out with a PhD, they're of course already in the 30s, and they cannot find regular jobs, but they also cannot find, very specific job that allows them to make use of their very specialized degree. So they ended up, doing odd jobs or doing, part-time teaching from one place to another and making very little income, which puts them really, again, at the bottom of society. And in the story, Yoshio was hired to start a rooftop greening project in the factory, but he was given neither tools nor human resources, and he ends up doing guided tour in the factory. And next, I would like to introduce the factory as Heterotopia, because if you're only looking at the three characters, the story will be just kind of a social criticism, as a satire. But what Oyamada created in the story is this amazing, space of the factory, and for us to look at the factory as the space itself as another space to reflect what we cannot see in Japanese society. I would suggest that the factory is a mirror of the invisible space of the underclass and the space of poverty, an imaginary counter space to the invisible yet real space of the working poor in Japan, and a space of illusion that exposes every real space, drawing from Foucault. And finally, a space with openings and closings that make it accessible, but also isolated. Now, next, I'm showing you this very, very simplified configuration of the industrial zone in the factory. I don't have very sophisticated skills in creating these diagrams, so forgive me. But this is what I would like to kind of suggest as a visualization of the industrial zone. First of all, my first suggestion is that you need to multiply this by at least 100 times, because it's much, much larger than what I present here in this simple configuration. And the clue to it is that there is a river that runs diagonally across the entire factory zone, and it cuts across it. And if you see the scale of this factory big bridge, the Kōjō Ohashi, it takes 1.5 hours to cross on foot. So you need to imagine how large this place is. And workers and people, visitors, whoever, deliveries will enter through the north exit. And once you enter, you see the headquarters. And there are many factory buildings. So this is just one of them, and many other buildings of different kinds. And then the east exit takes you to the company housing, modest apartment buildings for the workers. And then there's a bus stop with many, many bus lines taking you all over the industrial zone and also taking you out the south exit to the station. And then there's even a bus depot here. And then on this side, you have the waste processing plant. Obviously, you make something and then there's a lot of waste being created. And then there's the warehouse to house the products. And then there's the west exit. So there are 4 exits, you know. The place is not necessarily rectangular, but, you know, just as a visualization. And then there's even a factory museum where, of course, what I mentioned about the heterochronies, the slices of time that is kept in the factory. And the mysterious part of this factory, from the beginning to the end of the story, we never know what they produce. It's never described to us what they produce. So it's like this immense production line. There are many, many people working on the production line and shredding things and disposing things. But we never know, as a matter of fact, what is being produced in this factory. So basically, it is concrete, but it is abstract at the same time. Now, if it is only the people and the place, then it is not quite as fantastical or quite as imaginative as the mirror. But what makes this story really fascinating is the strange birds and bees in the factory. I would like to suggest that the living creatures in the story are exaggerated and transformed species modeled on existing birds and bees in the real world. They provide a mirror image and a link to the human counterpart in the story. And they connect the unreal factory grounds to the harsh reality of the underclass of non-regular workers and the unemployed in contemporary Japan. So now I will take you to what I hope is the most interesting part of this talk, which is about the strange creatures in the story. First, we have the factory cormorants, which is called the Kōjō in Japanese. I don't know whether in Venice, if there are cormorants. In Japan, there are 2 major types of cormorants. You have the sea cormorants and the river cormorants. And what you're looking at is actually a photo of actual river cormorants. They look like this. And Oyamada used this image to create the factory cormorants in this story. From the beginning of the story, you hear a lot of references to the cormorants. For instance, when Yoshiko first entered the factory grounds, the first line of the story is that the factory is great, and the moment the door of the basement opens, there is a smell of birds. That's the first line of the story. And her brother, Ode, dozing off on his job, you remember his mind-numbing job of correcting, you know, prose, boring prose. He is aware of shadows of fluttering black objects lingering in his eyes. And then Furifue, who is a scientist or trained as a scientist after all, his observation is more detailed. This is what he says. They are blackbirds. For a moment, I thought they're crows, but they appear to be cormorants. From the bridge, the edge of the water where the birds perch looked far away, but I can make out several birds gazing at the factory that stand on the other side of the sea. I can almost feel if I squeezed their narrow necks, I would have ink stain on my hand, the way their feathers look slimy and glossy. The sea is right there, and the part where the river widens must be where fresh water mixes with seawater. Can cormorants live in such a place, I wonder? Are they sea cormorants or river cormorants? Now, again, this is a picture of actual river cormorants. They like to stand like this in a row. And I'm borrowing this picture to help you visualize the Kōjō, or the factory cormorants in this story. They're jet black, they're 80 to 90 centimeters, and they can only fly a few meters at a time near the river. They have webbed feet, but they can swim and they can catch fish, but they don't like to swim very far out to the sea, and they prefer to eat leftovers actually discarded by the factory. And even though they flock together, they do not form pairs, they do not build nests, they do not lay eggs, and they do not raise chicks. And the typical flocks consist only of adult birds, and they don't communicate, nor do they nestle together. There's no sighting of any bird corpses, meaning that we don't know what happens when they die. And the factory staff in the story, sometimes they catch them for unknown purposes, and eventually they release the exhausted birds back to the sea. And some of the exhausted birds are seen to be back in the flock, but we don't know actually what happened to them in the end. So this is, the description of the factory cormorants. Now, I would take you to the next creature, which is the Nutorius. I don't know where you are, if you have ever seen nutrius or capybara in zoos, but in Japan, in zoos, you can see capybara, which is kind of similar to the Nutorius in this story. They're rodents based on real-life nutrius that are 40 to 7 centimeters long with the tail 30 centimeters. And they weigh about 10 kilos, but they can also grow up to 30 kilos in the story. They have grayish long fur, large front teeth, and 5 digits on each foot. They live in the river, but they don't like to swim in the story. And they are nocturnal, and they spend all day nearly in their nests. And they are herbivorous predominantly, but they also love to eat leftovers from the factory. And eating leftover tends to make them very fat, so it leads to obesity and gigantism even. And some of them grows up to 2 meters in length. So this is getting more and more fantastical as the description goes on. And the Nutorius they love to gather around the ditch and soak in warm waters. And pregnant females can be very aggressive. And each litter consists of 1 to 3 cubs, and sometimes even 5. And then they live anywhere between 10 to 40 years. So you see the lifespan becomes fantastical, And then the old Nutorius, they like to huddle around the ditches until they die and clog up the ditches. So they become a pain when they die, and you need to clear out the bodies and all that. And next is the third amazing, fantastical, strange creature, which is the washing machine lizards. So again, you notice that they look pretty much like a regular lizard, 5 to 10 meters in length, a little like a grayish and common lizard. So nothing so very fantastic about them right now. However, the special thing about these washing machine lizards is that they make nests underneath or behind washing machines and the 2 cleaning plants on the factory grounds. And their nests are made of bits of fiber and lint glued together by their secretion. And they move around the nest in search of heat from the washing machine. And they eat small insects and also byproducts like globs of washing machine detergent from the laundromats, basically. And then next is about the life cycle of these WML, the washing machine lizards. So like regular common lizards, they lay eggs, tiny ones, and they do not incubate them. So the hatching is left to chance. The vibration of the washing machine, of course, makes some of these eggs crack. So too bad if it cracks. And some of them, some baby lizards will emerge, but some of the eggs will crack and fall at the wrong time or dry up. And some of the lizards will be consumed by spiders, or they fall into the washing machine and drown. So it's very haphazard, And the average lifespan is 3 years, and it never leaves its nest. So when you sweep under the washing machines, you have numerous dead and dried up, desiccated bodies. So, both the Nutorius and the washing machine lizards, they just died by, the hundreds and thousands, and the bodies just clog up and become, waste. And with this, I would like you to think about how the birds and bees in this story mirror the underclass in Japan. what you have on screen is a picture of what we call the end-of-year food charity for non-regular workers. There's a term for that. It is called the Toshikoshi Hakemura. You remember Hakken Shain is these non-regular workers, meaning they are, just sent to work for a week, a day, a week, a month, or a couple of months at a place. And very often by the end of the year, they don't even have a place to live. And they don't have food. So charity workers or volunteers will do cookout in parks or, in neighborhoods. And then they'll be invited to, partake in a free meal, at least a warm meal at the end of the year. And maybe it's a little hard for you to believe, but this has been going on for over 10 years now in Japan, much, much longer really. And that it is still going on. And every time after a major disaster or during the pandemic now, the need becomes greater and greater, that there are many people who really cannot even afford a meal or warm food in contemporary Japan. In gray and dark coloration, the birds and bees are inconspicuous and hidden. So I would suggest that this parallels the three characters in the story tied to soul-depleting jobs. And in turn, I would suggest that they mirror the millions of non-regular workers in contemporary Japanese society. And the birds and bees rely on leftovers and scraps, and this parallels workers relying on cheap cafeterias in the story. And in turn, they mirror unskilled workers living from hand to mouth in contemporary Japan. Next, I would draw your attention to what I've mentioned as, the obstructed life cycles among the birds and bees. I mean, like the birds who don't build nests, don't raise chicks, and the lizards who, lay many eggs, but most eggs, most baby lizards most eggs are cracked, most baby lizards fall into the washing machine and dies. So this in turn will parallel the grim prospect for marriage in the story for the three characters. And if you remember at earlier part of my lecture, I talk about the low percentage of marriage in the underclass. People just cannot afford to get married and raise a family. The birds and bees accept their lot of mistreatment and abuse in the story, and that is reflected in the passivity and the silence in the characters, and that is also reflected in the underclass in Japan. They are very quiet and very inconspicuous, and they don't complain, they don't have demonstrations. And then the unnoticed deaths of the birds and bees parallel the incomplete stories of the characters, and in turn, that reflects the forgotten lives in Japanese society. So, people may walk past a homeless person in Japan like this and no one notices. And even if people notice, they will kind of look away and just walk by because there isn't much you can do. And so this is like, you see what you want to see, or you refuse to see what you don't want to see. And Oyamada Hiroko, through this story, she forces us to see this. The story ends with a very fantastical scene of crossing over to the other side, meaning crossing over to the side that is not part of what we consider the daily reality in the story. What happens is that at the end of the story, Yoshiko metamorphosizes into a factory cormorant as the story closes. This is the last few lines of the story. She says, "Not knowing what to think, I grab sheets of paper from my allotted container and feed them into the shredder. Without thinking, I keep feeding paper into the shredder. As I feed the last batch of paper from the container and my feet into the shredder, it dawns on me that I've turned into a blackbird. I can see human feet and arms. I can see gray lumps and green, and I can smell the sea." So of course, the readers are forced to ask why and what happened. At this point, I would draw your attention to Yoshiko's silent cry a little bit before she turns into a factory cormorant. She was standing on the bridge watching the birds, and she was thinking to herself, she was looking at the reflection on the water, you know, both of herself and the birds and the people crossing the big bridge. And she thinks to herself, I don't want to work. I really don't want to work. I can't see the connection between labor and the value of and meaning of life. I used to think there ought to be some connection between the two, but I've come to realize there's no connection whatsoever. I don't feel that I'm fighting against work and labor, but what I experience is a strange feeling that work is external to me, not a part of me, as though it is in a totally different world of its own. I've been trying my best so far, but what I consider trying my best, in fact, has no value at all. The evidence is in my deplorable condition now. I don't want to work. I don't want to work. But if I don't, I won't survive. I would like to suggest a parallel between what Marx wrote in the economic and philosophical manuscript of 1844 about estranged and alienated labor. Yoshiko experiences Marx's alienation in estranged labor. Labor is external to the worker, Marx wrote. She does not affirm herself but denies herself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely her physical and mental energy, but mortifies her body and ruins her mind. Estranged labor estranges from man his own body, as well as external nature and his spiritual aspect, his human aspect. And that's why we're seeing Yoshiko being dehumanized by her work, which is an alienated condition for her. In conclusion, I would like to draw the conclusion from what we've been thinking about so far, that the birds and bees stand for dehumanized workers in the vast factory grounds that survive unquestioningly at the mercy of a mysterious and immense production line until they're no longer useful. Oyamada is suggesting that Ushiyama Yoshiko's metamorphosis into a factory bird is not a singular case, and that the flocks of factory birds were once human workers, dehumanized by estranged labor. Alternatively, she may also be suggesting that the workers are once birds plucked from the flock, transformed into human workers until they're used up and thrown out to perish. Both are believable transformations in the heterotopia of the story. Heterotopia is a mirror of the invisible underclass. I would like to emphasize that. The working poor forms an expanding, invisible, and silent underclass, is toiling at the mercy of large corporation and conglomerates in Japan and in much of the advanced world. Many of these underpaid workers are engaged in manual labor, such as retailing, the service industry, such as sales clerks, cooks, waiters, waitresses, cleaning staff, cashiers, and so on and so forth. And many of them work full-time but still live in relative poverty, up to 16% in 2014. And finally, I would like to introduce this term, a society of disparity, which I think many of you might have come across or heard of. In Japanese, is kaksa shakai. The term kaksa shakai, a society of disparity, is first selected as one of the top 10 neologism in 2006. It was selected again as the top neologism in 30 years in 2013. And of course, the term neologism means that it's a word that was newly created. So kaksa shakai as a term did not exist before 2006, and it was created then, and then everyone is using that term now, daily, really. However, poverty in Japan is said to be invisible because Japan has no poverty line and subsequently no official statistics on poverty. In the heterotopia of the factory, Oyamada strips off the veil that hides poverty and the underclass and forces the reader to gaze steadily at the other space that the eyes refuse to see. So this is how I would like to bring my lecture to an end. I think you might have some questions, or you might have some feedback or comments for me. I would like to thank you all for listening and to allow me to juxtapose these two pictures, first of the cormorants on one side and the people waiting for the rush hour train in the morning, which is a scene that I see all the time. And for us to think about, this other world in Oyamada Hiroko story, and the world that we see, but we also refuse to see day in, day out in contemporary Japan, but also maybe in other parts of the industrial advanced world. So thank you very much for listening, and I will end my talk here. I will also stop sharing the slides now.
Thank you, Professor Yu.
Thank you, Professor Zanotti.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very inspiring, and you took us to a tour to fantastic beasts and where to find them in the clutches of capitalism. And it was very fascinating and interesting. I think we have time for some questions, Rosaria, right?
Yes, I would be happy to take questions and comments.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting lecture. And yes, I think we have time for any comments or questions. You could raise your hands or send questions and comments in chat if you would like.
Okay, I have a question. I see a question in chat. First of all, thank you for the conversion to 15,000 euros. And then I have a question in chat asking me about the meaning behind the concept of the river in the book. So I think the river, along with the sea, acts as a constant mirror in the story. And you have the characters always actually crossing the bridge back and forth. And every time they cross the bridge, they look at their own reflections in the either the river or the sea. And then also they see the birds and the Notorious, they also live along the river. So they're constantly reflecting on their own lives as well as the reflection of themselves in these strange creatures. So the river and the sea in the story, metaphorically, they serve as this mirror that that forces the characters constantly to be reflecting on a reflected life in this. We're looking at the story as the other space, but for them, the reflection of the river and the sea is also the other space for them. So I think that's one way to look at the mirror that is created by the water image in the story. Thank you.
Any other questions? You can raise your hand or write in to the chat.
Could Oyamada's work being compared to Akutagawa's kappa? And Ibu's message is a salamander. Oh, wow, very good. I don't know if those two authors followed Foucault's thought of heterotopia, but as I've read all three I see a common topic. This is a very, very perceptive and wonderful question. Thank you. And I'm very glad you brought this up. First of all, Akutagawa's kappa is one of the most astute, really social and political criticism that was written in Taisho in his time. And it is definitely a kind of a dystopia and heterotopia. And the idea, the fact that these writers, when they're writing these stories, they may not have the idea of heterotopia or the term heterotopia or even the term dystopia in their mind. But what happened is that they write a story that becomes a very good example for us to think about this intellectual concept of dystopia and heterotopia. So I think what you have brought up is definitely an excellent example for us to compare this story to what Akutagawa was doing in Kappa, especially the very astute political and social criticism that you're seeing in Kappa. And it was the same messages, the salamander, definitely the image of the salamander is definitely comparable to the image of the washing machine lizards, even though they're very different and the lizards are much smaller, but that really in many ways exotic and erotic imagery that is creepy and at the same time erotic, that makes us think of the crossing between species. It's definitely something that I think Oyamada as a writer is extremely drawn to. And if you ever have a chance to read some of her other stories, she is really just crazy about all sorts of fantastical creatures and plants and flowers and all that. And I think there is a great deal of commonalities between Ibuse's imagination and hers. And thank you for bringing up this really wonderful comparison. I totally agree with you. Thank you.
If I can add something.
Of course.
Listening to your lecture, I immediately thought to Non Sharankiroku from Sato Haruo.
Yes.
And thinking to that story, I began to think how dystopia and heterotopia are connected with each other. We can say that they are really connected, or we have to think to these concepts as different. I would like to know more about this interconnection.
Yes, Rosario, this is a very, very good and actually a very sophisticated question. We used to use terms like utopia and dystopia and use them as kind of opposites of each other. But as the field of utopian studies develop, we have more and more terms to really describe things that are not just utopia, not just dystopia. And then we realized that there are so many different kinds of utopias and so many different kinds of dystopias. And we also realized that utopia, you flip the coin and immediately it turns into dystopia. And it's also the other way around. And as a result, in these extended studies in utopian studies, we come up with terms like heterotopia or critical utopia or critical dystopia and stuff to try to find ways to describe the nuances in so many different stories. And the term heterotopia is particularly, I think, flexible, and also potentially it describes all sorts of possibilities, because heterotopia itself, hetero, as you know, is about just another world, right? Another space. And of course, topia is space. So it allows us to kind of read heterotopia either as a form of dystopia, or in parts of the heterotopia can be a kind of utopia. So that there's an inbuilt fluidity and flexibility in the term heterotopia that allows an author to really play with the term. So in the story, for instance, in this story, in the beginning, you might feel that, okay, in this immense factory industrial zone, they have food, they have jobs, they have housing, and, they never have to leave the place, and they have transportation, and there's the river and all that. It's kind of like a self-enclosed, almost like a utopia, right? But then you realize as you read on, it is also a kind of dystopia. So we're borrowing this term heterotopia to talk of a place that is constantly transforming, changing, that it can be wonderful you know, in one moment, and it could be terrifying in the another moment. So this is how we're using these terms with great fluidity, and thus it requires the reader to really constantly define and support how you're using such a term. And thank you for reading the, you know, the Sato Haruo's story and bringing it up. Sato Haruo, again, is very obsessed with both dystopia and utopia. So he writes both dystopian stories and utopian stories. And a record of Nonchalant in particular, he is particularly obsessed with the underground world, right? The underground, the underclass, the people who are subsisting in semi-human or non-human or inhuman conditions. So I think it also, you know, what you're seeing, Oyamada, whether she is drawing from the Sato Haruo story or not, she is definitely coming from the same kind of aesthetic and social sensibility in creating the world that she introduces in this story.
Thank you so much. So with Heterotopia, we can charge it. We can charge it Heterotopia with different meanings, and
yes.
This I think is really a good point to go on from all problems of taxonomy to with the, as you said, from this utopia, anti-utopia, critical utopia, and all these concepts that that are born. And thinking about this Oyamada Hiroko's work, it helps to focus on contemporary Japanese society, and I thought to Sakaguchi Kyohei's work of Zero Yen House that
yes.
is more visual. Yes,
yes,
and
yes.
Always thanks to Professor Yu, I've known Sakaguchi's work.
Yeah, Sakaguchi Kyohei is an amazing artist. Yeah, I noticed that there is a hand up, so maybe we can get that question.
If I may ask a question, yes, I wanted to ask to Professor Yu if actually my favorite mangaka is called Inio Asano, and his most famous manga is called Oyasumi Punpun, Good Night Punpun, where the main character is depicted as a bird from the start of the story to the end of the story. And yeah, he's actually a young boy. We know that he is actually a young boy, but he's depicted as a bird. And this his story, this manga follows the story of this main character from childhood to the adult life, and is like a social misfit. So and there is the theme of the, for example, it doesn't like gray, doesn't like the gray color, dark colors, is considered a social misfit from other characters, and the other characters are all human. So he is the only bird in the story, but we don't know if he is aware of this, how can I say, birdness of this. We don't know if that is an internal metamorphosis or something external, something that other people can see. So we don't know if the other characters see him as a bird or as a human. So there is not, how can I say, the internal spaces and external spaces are not separated. They are linked. And so this made me think like these heterotopias, of course, they are like the factory, the prison, real spaces, real existing places, but they are also internal spaces, and maybe the link between them, how can I say, it gets more and more like, if I were to say in Japanese, "aimai," team. We cannot really know if these places are internal, are inside of the characters, or are external. And most of all, the symbol of the bird, maybe the bird is like, how can I say, special, because, for example, dark birds actually remind us of the blackness of the suits wore by workers in Japan, most of all when young people in Japan go to have the famous mensetsu. They wear these black suits. They all look the same. So yeah, these places are internal and external at the same time, maybe.
It's a very intelligent question, and I really enjoy hearing your description of the manga, Oyasumi Pum Pum, and to make the link between that manga to this story, and also what you said about the internal and external being not separated, and that there is this kind of like ambiguity between the two. I really think that's a very intelligent reading of the story. And basically, if you remember the few lines that in the way the story ends in the Oyamada story, she sees herself turning into a bird, but she said, I also see human arms and human feet, right? So, I mean, is she actually turning into a bird, or, I mean, is it just in her head that she's turning into a bird? So I think what you're looking at is really this ambiguity in the metamorphosis, and that maybe we're looking at a state where, those two states of being are just constantly fluctuating. That, one moment you are this, you turn into this factory bird, and the other moment you're just, subsisting as a human being. And I'm not familiar with the manga, but it sounds very, very interesting, especially the idea of the bird person being the social misfit. And I think one of the main things that we often read about children or people who are ostracized is that they're not treated as human, right? So you may actually walk around in a human form that you have not actually transformed into a bird or a mouse or anything, but people treat you as non-human. People treat you as being less than human. And that's enough to create the sense that you're not human. So I think you're making a very intelligent and really, thank you. It really adds a very interesting aspect to the reading of this story.
Thank you.
I'm very impressed. Yes, thank you. And I think there are a couple of questions in chat. Okay, I wanted to ask this. In the end, it is clear that Ushiyama transformed into a bird, but what about Furufue and Ushiyama? Yeah. Do they turn into? Oh, okay. They didn't turn into. Isn't clearly stated, but we can understand it from some descriptions. Stefano, are you here? Did you read the story? Have you read the story?
Yes, I read the story, and in the end, it said that Furufue starts growing like fur on his hand, and Ushiyama starts getting really sleepy like the lizard. So maybe that's a hint that they're going to transform as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, thank you for the question. That remains a little bit like, again, ambiguous, but I think it will be very tempting to think that maybe they are also kind of going through some bizarre metamorphosis, and whether they transform or metamorphosize completely into those other forms, we actually don't know. But I think what you're looking at is Oyamada definitely looking at the most famous model of metamorphosis, which is Kafka's metamorphosis. That the metamorphosis itself may or may not be an actual metamorphosis, that it may or may not be physical, and it is a perception of that kind of transformation into something alienated. And I think it goes back to what I would like to suggest about how alienated work makes you transform you into something less than human or non-human, so that whether your physical form actually becomes something else, mentally you are reduced to, like in Kafka, you're reduced to that strange creature. And in this story, you're reduced or you're transformed into the factory bird or the lizard, or potentially the notorious. So thank you for bringing that up, Stefano. And I'm very glad that you read the story, because it is really not an easy story to read, right? It's very difficult to read.
Yeah, thank you for answering.
Thank you. And finally, maybe if you allow me, since we're reaching the final few minutes of our session, it appears, I would like to thank everyone again, really, to attend this lecture, and for really all your wonderful questions. I'm so impressed by, the way you, respond to the lecture, the way you read the story, and the way you formulate your questions are just really amazing. I think, first of all, thank your professor for really training this group of extremely perceptive and eloquent students in asking these wonderful questions. I've learned a great deal from your questions. I wonder how many of you have been to Japan or Tokyo, or have noticed some of the things that I suggested in the story about the hidden underclass, or the underclass, or homeless people, or people who are living at the underbelly of society. I wonder if anyone might have any comments about that. That's my question for you.
Unfortunately, I've never been in Japan because it was planned last year, but due to the pandemic, I cannot do my exchange. But if other students would like, Laura in chat, she.
About social problems in Japan, why do you think Japan does not want, okay, this is a very long question, does not want to fully recognize the problem of homeless people or underclass? Is it because of some kind of embarrassment? Also, are there in Japan many students who obtain PhD degree but cannot find work? Also, do you think Japan is moving forward in order to recognize these problems? I would like also to observe that Italy and Japan share in some degree the problem about post-PhD degree employment rate. Here in Italy, young people who reach the PhD degree have a hard time to find a non-part-time job. And then I have a comment saying that I've been in Yokohama and Tokyo, and also sometimes seen homeless people in the underground station. Okay, thank you for your response to my question and for your comment. I think most countries refuse to recognize that they have a lot of problems in terms of poverty, and because once you recognize these problems, that means you are obliged to provide help or solution. And Japan is never doing enough for people, for the underclass. And by not recognizing their existence, you get by not really providing the safety net. And the Japanese government still like to think that, everyone is okay. Everyone supposedly has some kind of health insurance. I mean, I think compared to the US, maybe that is true. Japan people do have, most people have some kind of health insurance. But Japan refuses to recognize there's a great deal of poverty among children, and there's a great deal of disparity. So I think as most advanced societies, Japan also is dealing with not knowing how to deal with, you know, now over 20 years of recession, and an entire class of people who can not rise above, no matter how hard they try, they cannot just, you know, really overcome the condition that they're trapped in. And yes, definitely, Japan has a lot of problem with not knowing what to do with people with advanced degrees. So we do have many people with an advanced degree, including a PhD, who are teaching as, if they're lucky, actually teaching as part-time teachers. But some of them cannot even get jobs as part-time teachers, so they have to do other jobs here and there. So they constitute, again, another class of people who are really stuck in between and living really in a very deprived economic state. So I think maybe not so different from Italy. Yes, the comment from someone who, Elena, who lived in Kobe for a year, you didn't see homeless people near the station. That's because homeless people in the past, I'm talking about like over 10 years ago, near Ueno station and stuff, you would see a lot of homeless people putting out these tents with blue tarps, you know, blue plastic sheets. But at some point they were completely driven away because it looks, of course, not presentable, and it and you know, Ueno or big station is supposed to be the showcase of Japan. So they are put in temporary housing, and many of them can stay in temporary housing for a couple of weeks or sometimes a month. And then many people would start staying in and out of what we call internet cafes, where you can, you know, they don't have rooms, but you can spend overnight in internet cafes, and then they drift from one job to another. So we have a lot of these temporary kind of arrangements for homeless people. But you still, from time to time, if you are observant, you would still see homeless people in tunnels or an underpass, or, you know, here and there. They tend to make themselves very, very inconspicuous. And also there's a lot of violence against street people. You hear about murders, you hear about them being beaten up, you hear them just being abused. So the people are very afraid of being homeless. But the pandemic actually has driven many people to kind of like just seek shelter in parks and stuff. So that's another new problem that we're looking at. Rosario, how much time do we have left? Because it seems to me that we have already.
Yes, I think it's time.
I think we're running out of time. Or do you have some more minutes, Rosario?
We have another lesson at 12:30.
Yes, I think maybe we should bring this to a close. And if you could send me the chat, if you record your chat and send it to me, I can address some of these questions by sending you the response. And I think, I mean, every happy occasion has to end. And if you have another class, I think you ought to be in time for your next class instead of being late for your next class.
We would have loved to have you in Venice if there's not this situation. And really, thank you for being with us today. It was a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you here. And before we can close, I would like to remember to all participants that this lecture was recorded and we shared after the 27th of March. Is it right, Professor Yu?
Yes, thank you.
So
yes, I just want to thank you.
Thank you. And we will keep update through our social accounts. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rosaria and Professor Zanotti and everyone for having me. It's a very great pleasure to meet you all and to, be able to, take your questions and speak with you. And it's really the highlight of my week, of my month, really, to meet all these, enthusiastic junior scholars. And I wish you, very happy, exciting adventures in your reading. And Rosario, you're already in touch with me, and I'm always here. I don't go anywhere these days. And I hope one day we will be able to meet in person. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope to meet you in person soon.
Yes, hope to meet you in person, and please keep in touch. And I will take my leave now. Thank you.
Thank you.